So, welcome everybody to our session on sleep. I am going to be very upfront with you on this one. This is my biggest development area. So, it's a very good example of the kind of knowledge action gap. Things like Matt Walker's research and work on this has really opened a lot of people's eyes as to the importance of sleep. And today we're going to talk about why your brain on 6 hours really isn't up to scratch. So, a lot of us will sacrifice sleep, thinking that's the thing that needs to go because we have super busy lives. But we're going to talk about the impact that has both on us cognitively, but also in terms of energy, presence, everything else. I am going to specifically not talk too much about physiology in this session because next week we're talking about hormones. I may refer to it briefly because there is a lot around sleep and hormones and how they're interconnected, but I don't want to preempt too much, and it would be a 2-hour presentation if we were talking about that. So we're going to talk primarily about cognitive performance and energy levels generally, and obviously if you have any questions, we can pick them up in the Q&A. But let's crack on for now. The 6-hour trap. So many of us, particularly those of us in Hong Kong, which Sarah is, will sacrifice sleep because we are bookending our days with things like logging back on. That's very, very common, particularly since COVID, actually, and all of the lockdowns. So we'll get home from work, we'll spend some time with our family, we'll log back on. It's very easy to let things like work eat into effectively our sleep window. And the pattern is that most people are aiming for at least 6 hours, thinking that would be sufficient. So it feels like the easiest thing to cut or the easiest thing to sacrifice when we're super busy and when there are lots of demands on our time. But the reality is, unfortunately, 6 hours, in fact, is not good enough. And this is very disappointing news to me. Anyone who has known me for some time will know that actually, in fact, this is my development area, as I said at the outset. And I was aiming to get up to 6 hours for several years. Now I have to aim to get up much further to 7 to 9 hours. So the reality is, unfortunately, it isn't good enough, and we're going to talk about why. And the research is very, very clear on this. The evidence I'm about to talk about is from a study on aggregation of studies actually back in 2017. And since then, the amount of research has gone up and up and up. But I wanted to show an aggregated collection of results. So I went back to something that was, very much medically confirmed and assessed multiple times. So if I just take a quick look at the evidence as to why 6 hours is not enough, as you can see from this, there are 71 different sample groups. So it can't be that the controls weren't there or that people were looking for a particular outcome, which is often the case with research, particularly when it's sponsored by pharmaceuticals. Lots of participants and lots of different research studies as well. Across these, 41% of those observed had a decline of sustained attention. And we're going to talk about this in some detail later. 32% have a decline of executive function. And when I talk about executive function, many of our listeners and many of you are executives, but I'm actually talking about the executive function as in our prefrontal cortex. So and I'm sure everyone's aware of this, but when we're talking about the way in which our brain works, we have our limbic system, and that's how we react emotionally. And then we have our prefrontal cortex, which is the area of our brain which we call executive function, but it's the one where we do our reasoning, our logic. It's where we pause and we think and we do strategic work. But what we're seeing is if we're only getting 6 hours sleep a night, then we've got a 32% decline in our ability to do that, which also means that we are very impulsive. So if I jump down to the 46% on the bottom right, it means we're relying on this part of our brain a lot more, the baseline. And it means that we are very reactive, very impulsive, and we have a significantly reduced emotional quotient. So we're not as emotionally intelligent as if we're getting those 7 to 9 hours sleep. And then finally, increase in attentional lapses. So I'm sure that any study now and in our own lived anecdotal experience, we are all constantly distracted. So whether we're multitasking on Zooms, whether we're just struggling to focus on what someone's saying, or even struggling to continue to do something. One of the best examples of this I discovered recently, I was listening to a podcast and they were talking about how now, if you're watching anything on sort of Netflix, for example, do you ever stop and think, why are they continuing to explain the plot to me? Do they think I'm really stupid? But it's because the writers are being incentivized to do something for double screening because we're on our phones while we're watching. So we might be scrolling, we might be messaging, we might be doing something else, but we're watching and then we're using our phones for something else. This is how distracted we are as a society now. So actually having those attentional lapses because we're not sleeping, but then also because we are distracting ourselves for dopamine hits as well, simply means that when we're showing up, we're really not showing up at our best. I can see some snickering happening there. So I'm sure that will come up in the Q&A. So, what happens at around 6 hours? When we're in the lab, we notice a performance collapse. So, on the very first time, if we just do it once, let's say last night I couldn't sleep very well, I was super anxious about doing this presentation, and I only got 6 hours sleep. I'm going to notice it. So, I'm going to feel it this morning. I might have an extra coffee. I might try and make sure I get some extra daylight in the morning. I might, I can counter it slightly, but I'm going to feel that I've had it. So one night is a kind of tactical decision, and we're going to talk about that. Compounding that over multiple nights means that we're going to start building up effectively compound interest, just like in banking. We're going to start building up the negative impacts of not having sufficient sleep. So after 2 weeks, it's the same as if we hadn't slept at all. That's how our brain is functioning. And as I said, it's a progressive decline. The problem and the danger with this is because we are over that time reducing our ability to be vigilant and pay attention and have any emotional sensitivity, we feel like we're fine because we don't notice. So this is a bit like burnout when we talked about it last week. The very thing that is happening is causing us to realize it's not happening until it's an absolute crash and an absolute nightmare. And as I said, from a brain dysfunction perspective, our prefrontal cortex, where we do the planning, where we have our impulse control, when we actually stop and think about how to respond rather than simply react to something, is functioning far less effectively. We're not able to reason and see what's happening. We don't fully feel it, but after 2 weeks of 6 hours, or in my case, a decade of 6 hours, I dread to think the damage that's done, you don't fully feel it. You don't know. So just to compare, if you're to get the 7 to 9, which we're recommended, and it's a wide bracket, and the reason why it's 7 to 9, lots of people might leave this and go, right, well, I need to catch up a lot on sleep debt, so I'm going to start sleeping 10 hours a night, as if. But if we did, there's actually an inverse U in terms of the benefits of sleep. So you don't want to get less than 6, but you also don't really want to get more than 9. If you are, then you're going to suffer different cognitive impairments, and we'll talk about that briefly when I come to that slide in a moment. But on 6 hours sleep compared to 7.5, for example, our reaction time is slowed by 10 to 15%. So that means that if something happens, let's say we're driving, it's going to slow our ability to react to something happening around us. In terms of the attention lapses that we were talking about, and this is phones aside, nothing else taken into consideration, but when they tested people, it was 2 to 3 errors per 10 minutes. And for people who are over 7 hours, it was less than 1 error per 10 minutes. So it's a significant increase in terms of the number of mistakes that we're making. The executive function I've talked about quite a lot. So that's a 32% decline in your ability to reason, to plan, to think strategically, and we're 32% more likely to react rather than respond. Error rates, obviously significantly elevated. Our memory consolidation. So what we're doing in the day when we're sleeping, a lot of that, and I'll come to the benefits of sleep shortly, but a lot of that is consolidated when we're asleep. So if something happens or we learn something or we read something in the day, if we're not sleeping 6 hours, then we're going to struggle to actually consolidate that memory and that learning. Our impulse control is weakened, which is why, and as I said, I'm not going to talk a lot about hormones, but this is one thing I will talk about. If we're sleep deprived, we have a hormone called ghrelin, which basically, I call it the ghrelin gremlin, makes us reach for the sweet stuff. So it will make us comfort eat. It means we cannot tell when we are full. So if I've had a week of bad night's sleep, you can guarantee you're going to find me with a spoon and a jar of peanut butter, just shoveling that in, even though I'm super full, because my brain is telling me it's craving survival and it's craving calories and craving energy. As I said, I will focus on hormones primarily next week, but it has a significant impact on our insulin sensitivity and our emotional regulation as well. And then finally, as you would expect with all of this building up, then our ability to solve complex problems is significantly degraded when we got the 6 hours versus 7+. Okay, so the accumulation piece. I've talked a little bit about compounding. This is how it does compound, and this is what we've noticed. So as I said, if you make the tactical decision and it's like, let's say you've got a flight the next day, 6 hours, you're going to notice when you get up, you're going to need some extra stimulation, you're going to feel it all through the day, and you will notice the difference. By the time you get to night 3 of only having 6 hours, so let's say it's a consistent thing, your performance is going to plateau. So you'll stop feeling it so much, but it will be at a degraded level. So it's going to be that 32% less effectively of how you're capable of showing up. On the second week at 6 hours, as we said, you've effectively now built up an entire night's worth of sleep debt. So it's the same as having 24 hours of not sleeping at all. but you've adapted, and we're great at adaptation. That's why we're so good at what we do, and high performers in particular are excellent at adaptation. But that deficit is still there. You just can't feel it. You feel fine, but actually you're really not showing up. And you've now got about 20% less energy in terms of the way you're showing up every single day. And then finally, if you keep going, by month 2 of just 6 hours sleep, we're looking at structural damage and then significant risks later in life. As always with our bodies, it will keep us going for a long time and we will feel fine. And then it's going to come and whack us in our 50s, 60s, and 70s. And it's very hard as humans because of recency bias to start investing now in things that are going to make us feel better or be better in the future, because it's hard for us to relate to future us. But anything that we're doing now is clearly going to impact our health span and our longevity. A final note on this one. Lots of people think, well, I will just catch up at the weekend if they're in a corporate job. This is a horrible idea. So first of all, you might be able to sleep the physical amount that you have accumulated over the week from a sleep debt perspective. But as we talked about last week, when it comes to our circadian rhythms, that regularity and our body understanding hormonally whether we're awake, asleep, what's required in terms of energy production is key. And so actually, if we don't have a regular wake time and sleep time, we're significantly impacting our biology as well, and our physiology and our energy levels. So you can do it. You might feel better for a day, but longer term, it's not the solution, unfortunately. Okay, I've got a few more slides. I'm going to pause and just see if there are any questions now before we get to the end in the Q&A piece. There are a few more slides than last week because this is a big topic.
I'll jump in, Liz, if I may. And again, forgive me for being a little late. So I have 3 children, in addition to the job plus husband. So I guess my challenge is more the consistency around the hours that I sleep. So I may in one evening have an 8 hours sleep, great, fantastic. Then the next night, 6, etc., etc. Is that even more damaging to sort of have an inconsistent thread than having a sort of a consistent lower amount of sleep or higher amount of sleep, if that makes sense?
So the inconsistency will impact your circadian rhythm and your hormone balance quite significantly. Gentlemen on the call, please forgive me for saying this, but one of the points on this slide actually refers specifically to dementia risk. The reason why we see 2 times more risk of Alzheimer's and dementia in women over men is motherhood, effectively, and caring obligations. Because obviously, when you have children, there's a good decade of your life often where you have interrupted sleep.
Yes.
That's just the reality of it, right? And then we go into a phase where we have parental caring as well. So our sleep is significantly affected throughout that time. There's a combination of that and then a lack of awareness around hormone changes and how to treat them with lifestyle interventions that is contributing to this significant and very dangerous risk, because we're twice as likely as the gentleman on this call to suffer from dementia. The consistency piece, it's important to be as consistent as possible. But honestly, if you've got the option of an 8-hour versus going, well, I can consistently get 6 hours, then I'm always going to say have the inconsistency and more sleep, purely because the more you have, the better a chance your brain has at cleaning itself out, removing the toxins and the proteins that shouldn't be there. Ideally, it would be consistent, but we have to be realistic about real life.
Fabulous. Thank you. Although I would say it's probably going into more 2 decades of interrupted sleep at this stage, but hey ho.
I don't even have the excuse of children, Sinead, just an addiction to work, unfortunately.
Oh, bless you. Thanks, Liz.
How do we
Stefan,
feel about medicated sleep?
do we mean pharmaceutical or do we mean supplementation, Nina?
I don't know what these words mean, but I mean something I buy from a nice man that helps me go to sleep.
That sounds pharmaceutical to me, if you're trotting down to Fanda. So for short-term interventions and things like jet lag, for example, or high points of stress, sometimes people suffering from depression require medical intervention. I would always recommend going to a doctor and getting that prescribed. And it can be a way, if someone has insomnia, for example, it can be a way of trying to reset some of that. But if it's a long-term requirement, then that is a cause of concern. But it's better than having no sleep at all. Again, I am not a doctor. I have to disclaim that. This is going to be on YouTube. So let me be very clear, no medical background. But when it comes to supplementation, as far as I'm concerned, what's good enough for the top athletes in the world is good enough for me. So many of them are on things like valerian, passion flower, ashwagandha, and particularly magnesium if you do work out. So having magnesium and magnesium glycinate specifically a couple of hours before sleeping can be very, very helpful. Yes, so I can't comment on the medical intervention side of it, but on a supplementation side, and again, it's always good if you're going to use it consistently to get advice. I'm actually controversially not a huge fan of melatonin. So again, unless it's specifically for jet lag, adding melatonin into the system, particularly because most of the sort of the off-the-shelf melatonin is at very, very high dosage levels, and we don't realize how much of an impact that has. And if you're only going to sleep for 6 hours, typically it's not going to get out of your system. So people will wake up feeling more and more groggy in the morning and think that they need more coffee, whereas actually it's more about the dosage that we have as well. Now, Stefan is on the phone, and I know that he knows a lot about sleep. So I don't know if you've got anything you want to add to that, Stefan.
Yeah, maybe actually. So, hello everyone. Actually, I'm partnering with a functional medical doctor, and actually, he doesn't actually prescribe sleep pills at all because, from his standpoint, and this is based on research, it destroys your deep sleep. So you have the impression of sleeping, but actually you're not really sleeping. So you are at least not recovering, which is one of the main functions of sleep. So you need to pay attention and especially not enter a long-term strategy based on sleep pills for trying to sleep.
Okay, 100% not what Nina wanted to hear, but I'm seeing her at the end of this week, so we can have the discussion.
Yeah, I'm just thinking what is actually practical, right? Yeah, but no, I appreciate
And maybe
it.
if I can add something, actually, that was from last week's, so the first episode. What's very important is your circadian rhythm alignment. And if you're in the UK, as I am in Belgium, so we started the discussion with the grey weather. So that's a big issue because people actually, even in countries where there's a lot of sun, if you live in a tower, for instance, you might not actually get exposed to sunlight, even in the sunny country. But there's a way to get over that, which is to use luminotherapy. So, for instance, there are glasses that you can wear that allow you to get your sunshine or sunlight dose every morning while still actually doing your stuff, preparing breakfast, eating, whatever you do. Um, and actually, it has the exact same effect as if you were outside for 20, 30 minutes and getting exposed to natural sunlight. And that's actually the first thing to do, in my opinion, to align your circadian rhythm, even if you live in a country where you don't have a lot of sunshine, especially in wintertime. That will probably actually help you more than your sleeping pills over time, I mean, because you would realign your circadian rhythm to what your biology requires.
Well, I guess we now all know what I'm getting Nina for her birthdays. And Stefan, if you could maybe share the link to that, then we'll include it in the
Yes,
episode recording as well. That would be awesome.
yes.
So, yeah, I have to say, so I live in the UK now. I use the Lumi Light in the morning as well, which effectively replicates sunlight or the impact of sunlight. And I just sit there working in front of that for half an hour in the morning and stuff. Because the one thing I really, really miss about Hong Kong is while the light patterns change slightly, it's nothing like over here. All right. So, any other questions on this part before I crack back on with some slides? No? Okay. So, we've talked a lot about the cognitive function risk, so the executive function and the ability of effectively that declining over time. And it's multiple domains. So, it's reactivity, it's our ability to reason, it's our reactivity as well, our ability to respond to something quickly. We have, as we talked about briefly, dementia risk. So this goes across both genders. It is a significant risk, and particularly as it compounds over time. I quite often write about the fact that for the first 10 years of my career, I slept 4 hours a night. Nothing now scares me more about the fact that there is probably no chance I'm escaping this risk. So I do everything I can, things like learning chess, learning Mandarin, whatever it is, to try and build neuroplasticity. There are things, and hopefully AI will save me by finding some cures by the time it gets to it. But yeah, I've probably got about 15 years left before this really kicks in as a real risk, because it does compound over time. And there's only so much you can do to then counter it. And then from an Alzheimer's perspective, obviously one of the most devastating diseases, particularly if you've ever been in a family where, and you do have a slightly higher genetic predisposition if you have people in your family with Alzheimer's. But again, having poor sleep now is going to significantly increase our risk of Alzheimer's at a later date in our lives as well. So it's really not about a lifestyle choice. And I'm as guilty as anyone of sacrificing this to then say, right, well, I need to get this done, or I need to meet this deadline, or I haven't seen this person for a long time, so I'm eating into my sleep window. But it is genuinely a structural requirement for our brains, which we're going to talk about. And I think the first thing to call out, and I really like Matthew Walker's work on this, and as I said, he's brought it really into the mainstream, so a lot of people understand why we need it better now. But I think the one thing to be very clear on is people think that sleep is, a nice to have. People say stuff like, I'll sleep when I'm dead. I mean, you are accelerating that timeline very quickly. But I'll sleep when I'm dead, or sleep is for the weak, or whatever it may be. But every single mammal on the earth sleeps. Now, over millions of years, if it wasn't essential and it wasn't necessary, that would have been effectively bred out through evolution. Because why would we be so vulnerable? If you think about you when you're asleep, we're at our most vulnerable. Why would we need to do that for 8 hours a night when we were out in the wild, or even now, if it wasn't absolutely necessary? It would have just been removed from our genetic code over time. But it hasn't. And it hasn't because it does have some very, very important functions. So first of all, as I said, it consolidates learning. So everything that's happening in the day, our brain is processing. And bear in mind, we're only really aware of a very small proportion of the information our brain is taking in because it filters that out. So it consolidates that learning, it processes it. And when you're doing things like dreaming in that REM stage, that's because we're processing information and we're laying down those patterns for future referral, all in our subconscious. It clears out the metabolic waste. So when I'm talking about things like dementia risk and Alzheimer's, this is apparently, it seems, this cleaning process that happens when we're asleep. So there's pruning that happens around connections and telomeres. And then the lymphatic system is removing toxins that are building up over the course of the day. And it needs enough time to do that. This typically happens in the deep sleep phase. It helps us regulate emotion. So during that decade, when I slept for 4 hours a night, I can tell you I was probably the most horrible human to work with because I had zero EQ at all. Like I just had no time for anyone, anything, including myself, right? So you set super high standards and you're just a bitch. We're not very good at regulating our emotions if we haven't had the time to recover while we're sleeping. It optimizes our prefrontal cortex, and that's very linked because it means we can reason, we can rationalize, we can choose to respond rather than just purely react. And when we decide not to sleep, all of that's truncated. So some of it will happen. It will depend on those stages of sleep, and to the point of like whether we're actually getting into deep sleep or not, which we discussed earlier around medication. That deep sleep is needed for the cleaning to happen of our brain. The consolidated learning requires the REM stage. So if you ever wear a wearable or have your sleep tracked, or if you just look up sleep stages, you'll see that on a healthy sleep pattern, we drop very quickly into deep sleep for somewhere between 90 minutes to 2 hours. We come back up, we shelf a little bit, and then we drop back in, and then we come back up. And ideally, we're getting 2 to 3 cycles of that deep sleep while we're sleeping. But what happens when we shorten that is we might get 1 at best. We might just have very light sleep. And I'm going to come to everyone's favorite toxin shortly and talk about some of the things we might need to be thinking about removing, because when we do think we're in deep sleep, very often we're actually not. So it is good to have a means of tracking this at some point. So the hidden cost of this, we're losing accuracy, we're losing efficiency, really, and speed of processing. We're losing creative problem solving because we don't actually have the capacity to be creative about anything. We're losing emotional resilience, our decision quality is poor, and we're losing the ability to consolidate those long-term memories. So that also means that we then don't have the same reference patterns, frameworks, and structures. Normally, when we encounter anything, our brain is very quickly going, I know this, or I don't know this, or I am creating a pattern and referring this back to my previous knowledge so I know how to respond to a situation. If those memories aren't and that framework isn't being laid down, we effectively are narrowing our ability to handle complexity. And I think everyone can agree that the world is just getting more and more complex. So having that is an advantage. What you gain by sleeping for 6 hours or less, you get more errors when you're under pressure. You have slower reaction times. In crisis moments, you gain poorer judgment. When it matters the most, you have the ability to burn out much, much more easily because you have less resilience and, of course, increased health risks. And we'll talk about the physiology side of this next week as well. But just to touch on it here, so you're more prone to injury, statistically, far more prone to injury. And the older we get, the more important this is, of course, because things like falls, for example, and the ability to react well to them is critical for our health span. But also hormonally, we're setting ourselves up for failure as well. So just to close out, the reason why I would like people to start trying to think about this from luxury to a non-negotiable, it is genuinely a biological requirement that we sleep. Otherwise, we just wouldn't need to do it anymore. So it's a fundamental need. It's a performance multiplier. This is what we call a keystone habit. So once you have this and you switch this on, it makes you better in every facet of your life. You get to show up as a better human, you are healthier, you have more energy, and you have more cognitive capability as well. So you can show up better at work, you can show up better at home, you can show up better wherever. It's the cognitive baseline on which every other function rests. So whether that's hormonal, whether that's how we are thinking, whether that's our executive function, this is the baseline and the foundation we need to be investing in. And it genuinely is an investment. So like I said, it's hard to imagine ourselves in 20, 30 years. It's a lot easier now that we have things like AI, because you can just get it to generate a picture of you and we're visually wired. So you can look at yourself in 30, 40 years and be like, actually, do one of me when I'm getting great sleep, do one of me when I'm not getting great sleep, and see if that's motivating. And also, because we do have a lot of people from corporate watching this, it's a competitive advantage. So if you're getting 7 to 9 hours sleep and all of your peers are getting 6 hours sleep, who's going to win when it comes to strategy, budget, everything else? You're going to be the one that can show up better. And then just very briefly, I'm going to talk a little bit about the optimal window here. And I do have a slide in a moment about what this means if you are in charge of a team, of an organization, or if you have influence over someone who is running a business as well, because it's not just you that's going to benefit from this. You need to think about the implications across your team as well. So the optimal window, 7 to 9 hours per night. As I said, there's the inverse U, so you don't want to be getting too much or too little. Consistency does matter. I'm sorry, Sinead, but it does. So as much as we can, we're optimizing for consistency. I say this knowing I'm going to be on a plane and in different time zones for the next 6 weeks. So life happens. I get it. But we need to try and have as much consistency as possibility. Erratic sleep patterns. So if we're consistently on planes and everything else, you will see more cognitive impairment than if we have those consistent windows. But again, if it means that consistent window is at 5 hours or less than 6 hours or, less than 7 hours, we're still aiming to optimize for more. And then quality and quantity, it is about the actual deep sleep piece. It is about the REM, as I said. It's critical for restoration. So we are also looking to monitor, track, and encourage the sleep quality. And there are some things we can do around sleep hygiene, for example, the temperature of the room, getting ready beforehand, making sure that our body knows that we can switch off now and that we're safe. That will significantly impact our ability to drop into deep sleep. So, what can we do to improve our sleep? Actually scheduling this with ourselves like a non-negotiable meeting is essential, and not letting anything eat into that. I'm not saying necessarily put it into your diary, but actually back in the day when I was working in Hong Kong, maybe that would have been helpful. So actually making sure that the diary was blocked and people couldn't put a 10 p.m., 11 p.m. meeting into my diary. Consistency, we're aiming for the same sleep and wake time even across weekends, because we want our bodies to know and have that circadian rhythm. So as Stefan said, it's very important that we're optimizing for our circadian rhythms. And the environment is key. So having a cool, dark, quiet environment to sleep in is fundamental. And around somewhere between 19 and 20 degrees centigrade, I work in centigrade, so apologies, but here it says 68 Fahrenheit. I hope that's accurate. Is optimal for the onset of sleep. In terms of wind down, as I said, it's really important that your brain knows it's time to go to sleep. So having a routine that's consistent every time can be very, very helpful, because it effectively just signals to your brain that we're done now, we're going to slow down, we're going to get ready. And that means that when you do go to bed, you can actually have that drop into deep sleep as quickly as possible, which is what we're aiming for. Screens, I know that we are all addicted to them, but having them in the bedroom, having the devices even in the bedroom, has been shown to significantly impact our sleep quality. So I would strongly recommend, and I'm sorry to ask you to spend money, but buying an alarm clock that is not screen-based and having that in the bedroom, because everyone's first excuse is, but it's my alarm clock. It may be your alarm clock, but it's also negatively impacting your sleep quality. So put your phone on charge outside of the bedroom. Ideally, don't have screens at least an hour before you go to sleep. The other thing I'm going to talk about here, I said I was going to talk about the toxin, is not the screens. It's a different addiction for many, or a crutch for many, alcohol. So when we drink alcohol, a lot of people go, oh, I slept so well because I'd had a drink. No, you did not. So you passed out. Your initial drop into sleep was very rapid, But the chances of you going into deep sleep are very, very slim. And you only have to look at anyone who has wearable data that their HRV is super, super low. So that's the heart rate variability. We're aiming for that to be as high as possible. It will go to almost de nada. Super, super low. Your body is not recovering. Your brain is not recovering when you are in alcohol-induced sleep. So I know that lots of people love to have a drink, but if you're going to do that, that's absolutely fine. Zero judgment here, but try and stop within a few hours before you go to sleep so that your liver has a chance to process it as much as possible before you sleep. It will not help you sleep. It makes us feel like we're going to sleep faster, but we're not getting quality sleep as a result. Exercise, as I said last week, it's only 7% of the population that can exercise late at night and then go straight to sleep. It generates metabolic function, it generates energy. It means that our bodies have a hormonal imbalance when it comes to going to sleep. So doing regular physical activity will absolutely help your sleep quality. But ideally, you don't want to be doing that within 3 hours of going to sleep. Same for food. Ideally, you're aiming for 2 to 3 hours before you go to sleep, having finished eating as well, so that your body can start to digest and it's not distracted by that. And again, you can see that very much in your HRV and your resting heart rate. If you eat close to bedtime, your resting heart rate will be higher because your body is working to digest what you've just eaten. And then finally, caffeine. I love a black coffee. I love green tea, but ideally you're stopping drinking that around 2 p.m. in whichever time zone you're in. I can see the frowns right now, but if you want really good sleep, it does have a long half-life effectively. So caffeine, it takes up to 8 to 10 hours for our bodies to actually reduce it. If you're like me and you're like halfway through the day, you're like, I'm going to have a second coffee. Half of the caffeine from my first coffee in that day is still in my system and it's still working. I'm just dropping off. And for me, it's largely habitual as well. I enjoy the break. I enjoy going to make the coffee. I enjoy drinking the coffee. I don't believe in decaf coffee. I don't know why you would do that to yourself. But there we go. So yeah, but ideally aiming to cut caffeine off before 2 p.m. will significantly help over time the quality of your sleep. And it will also help your energy levels, believe it or not, but that does take a little while to kick in. So, all right, finally, the business case if you're running a team, and then I will stop talking and we will have some more question time and you can all tell me I'm crazy. If you are leading a team or running a business or in charge of any people or have any influence over people, I want you to think about how much impact this will have on the rest of your team. So we have a lot of cultures at the moment. I ran a team myself. I was completely guilty of this myself, of people working very, very long hours and working late into the evening. And it would definitely have been eating into my team members' sleep windows. It didn't matter how much I said, I don't expect you to work in the evening. If they saw that I was online, they would be emailing me because they wanted to demonstrate that they were doing a great job. However, over time, our team was in a highly regulated environment and we had to make a lot of decisions about whether we were doing the right thing or the wrong thing. Their decision and their judgment would have been significantly impaired. And in hindsight, I probably wasn't doing anyone a favor and the quality of our work would have been deteriorating. So if we're getting less than 6 hours sleep, we are as significantly impaired on our cognitive function as if we'd been drinking and over the limit, the legal limit for driving. So us doing that every single day and just working through the night, but doing that extra couple of hours to catch up, it's effectively like we're emailing drunk, which would explain the quality of some of the emails coming through and some of the tone as well. So not a great thing if you're a leader. The team running on chronic sleep restriction, they're going to be less creative. They're going to be much slower to pivot and they'll be way more conflict avoidant. And if you have a team that has zero psychological security and is being highly conflict avoidant, this could be one of the reasons why. From a leadership perspective, if you're 32% impaired from an executive function capability perspective, you're making worse decisions and you're much more inclined to take more impulsive, rash, riskier decisions as well because you're tired. And then the final I would just say is it might seem like it's soft to get sleep, but from a leadership perspective, making sure that we're getting adequate sleep is probably one of the hardest things we can do. And it will have one of the largest returns on investment when it comes to actually being able to compete externally, internally, whatever that may be, because you're making better decisions. You're showing up with a much higher prefrontal cortex capability. So you're able to think strategically, you can see bigger patterns and you're not reacting and you're not taking the risks that you don't need to. So it really is an operational baseline for peak performance in your team as well. Final slide. What I would ask you to do, everyone's got the sleep template. It says for a week, but ideally, if you can do this for 30 days, you don't need to have a wearable, but just tracking is 2 minutes in the morning, 2 minutes in the evening before you go to bed, becoming aware of your patterns. Because once you start writing it down and seeing the data, it's really hard to get away from. Identify for yourselves, if you were to have a 7 to 9 hour window, when can you do it? And how can you schedule that with yourself as if it was a non-negotiable meeting? Start with one change. If it could be anything, I would encourage the screens. I'm not going to ask people to give up their evening drink or even their coffee after 2 p.m. But if you can, get rid of the screens an hour before you want to sleep and put the screens outside, the devices outside of the bedroom. And then finally, pay attention to the difference. So when you're doing that audit, be honest with yourself. Maybe it's that lever that you've pulled, that one that you've chosen, isn't the right lever and you want to switch it up. But be honest about whether you have greater energy, how you're solving problems, track the improvements that they emerge, because as we're doing that, we're building a sense of self-efficacy and we're building momentum towards some habit change that would significantly reward. Very small shifts in this space can have a massive return. When you look at how negatively it can impact us, even 15, 20, 30 more minutes sleep can start to have a massive compound benefit as well if we swing it the other way. So noticing those benefits is key. All right, Q&A time. I'm going to ask a question to everyone else first. Before you answer it, I'm going to turn the recording off so that you can be very open and honest.